Smith. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. I can say this. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. When Charles Dickens wrote those opening lines of A Tale of Two Cities, he was thinking of the aftermath of the French Revolution. However, it seems to Lloyd that they actually apply to every time period in human history, and that both points of view are correct. This evening, Lloyd will finish his 7th Competent Communicator Award with Project 10, Inspire Your Audience, by explaining why he feels that way and what he thinks it means for all of us. Lloyd Smith and his speech 164.
We tend to think that we are living in a unique time, but the most unique time in all of American history was actually the 19th century. There was no greater change in the United States than the change that took place between 1800 and 1900. And that change was our shift from being a rural agricultural nation to being an urban industrial nation. Between about 1800 and 1875 or so, the population of the large cities in the United States doubled. And then it doubled again in the last 25 years of that century. What that meant was that thousands and thousands and thousands of people flocked to all of the big cities, New York, Chicago, Boston, and so on. And the same thing was occurring in Europe, in London and Paris. All of those people needed to have goods and services and houses and food and everything else you can think of. And the main means of transportation at that time was a problem. It clogged the city streets with traffic, incredible gridlock, nearly 24 hours a day. There was air pollution that people had to contend with, and ground pollution as well. There were traffic accidents that killed hundreds and hundreds of people every year. Now, it probably sounds like I'm talking about the car, but what I'm talking about is the 1880s and 1890s. There weren't more than about 2,000 cars on the entire Earth back then, and most of them were one of a kind, experimental vehicles. I'm talking about the main means of transportation back then, which was the horse. And that was a big, big problem. In New York City, for example, there were roughly 200,000 horses living within the city of New York. That was one horse for every 17 people. They had to have that many horses because there was a tremendous need for endless streams of supplies to flow into the city. Food and lumber to build houses with, and bricks and everything else you could think of. The streets were gridlocked with traffic nearly 24 hours a day. That's because there were no traffic lanes or traffic signals of any kind. And there were dozens and dozens and dozens of horse-drawn wagons and carriages and conveyances of all kinds, some of them driven by people who were drunk most of the day. The horses themselves tended to break down, and when they did, they were often dispatched right where they fell in the streets. Most of the stable owners had life insurance policies on their horses, believe it or not. But to prevent fraud, the insurance policies required that the horses be euthanized by a neutral third party, a policeman or a veterinarian. It sometimes took hours for those people to show up, and so there were horses thrashing around on their sides on the streets for sometimes all day long. After the horses were dispatched, if you think about it for a moment, a dead horse is not a small thing to deal with. And so the street cleaners generally would just leave them for a week or two until they softened up enough to be sawn into pieces and hauled off. You can imagine what the streets must have been like with all of that going on in New York City. At the same time, there was constant crashing noise. The streets were made of cobblestones and bricks, and so the wagon wheels, the wooden wagon wheels, were rimmed with iron in order so that they would last longer. There was a constant clanking, thrashing noise from very early in the morning to very late in the evening until it got dark. horses were shod with iron horseshoes, and so that was also a source of noise. There was endless shouting and screaming and whatnot from the people trying to get through the streets as well. Numerous people had nervous breakdowns, although back then they didn't call it nervous breakdowns, but nobody really knew what was going on. They were going crazy with the constant noise. There was also the continuous threat of being killed in the streets by horses and wagons. In 1900, 200 New Yorkers were killed in horse-related accidents. In the year, in 1900. No, in 1800. No, in 1900. Yeah, I was right the first time. In 1900, 200 New Yorkers were killed in horse-related accidents. In the year 2000, 200 New Yorkers were killed in car-related accidents. But the population is 5 times as much as it was 100 years ago. That means a New Yorker living in the year 1900 had 5 times the chance of being killed in the street by traffic as a New Yorker today. The worst thing of all, though, was the horse manure. A typical horse produces about 25 pounds of manure per day. 200,000 horses, you can do the math. That's close to 5 million pounds of horse manure a day, every day, 365 days of the year. Where do you put it? It's not easy to put something that's somewhere when it's already everywhere. And that was the problem the New Yorkers faced. Now, in earlier times, when there weren't as many people or horses, there was actually a tremendously lucrative market. The stable owners would sell their manure to farmers who would use it on their farm fields. But when the horse population skyrocketed, the market collapsed, and nobody would buy it because people were trying to give it away. The stable owners would buy vacant lots and stack them 75 feet tall with piles of horse manure right in between like buildings where people were living and whatnot. And you can imagine what it smelled like in the summer weather, but in the rainy weather it was actually worse. And that's because the streets became lakes, little rivers of liquefied manure flowing into people's basements and becoming slippery and whatnot. It was incredibly dangerous. The horse manure was also a serious health problem, not just an aesthetic problem with the smell and whatnot. It bred billions and billions of flies, and these are big flies, blowflies and horse flies. There were no window screens, they hadn't been invented yet, no air conditioning, so everybody's houses had thousands of flies in them, and they carried in very dangerous diseases with them. People were sickened by them all the time. In addition, when it rained, the stuff would flow into people's basements. You've all seen pictures of those brownstone buildings, those classic brownstones in New York City that have a staircase that goes from the street up to like a second floor entrance. That was actually a design feature that was created to allow the homeowners to rise above the lake of liquefied manure that was flowing around most of the time. This was not a happy situation for anybody, as you can imagine. In 1898, the city of New York convened the world's first urban planning conference to deal with this problem, with the topic of horse manure. Had experts from all over the world, and the rest of the big cities in the United States, show up to try to figure out what to do. It was supposed to be a 10-day conference, but on the 3rd day, the experts issued a communique saying that there was no solution to the problem, that we were doomed, and the conference broke up and they all went home. The world had gotten to the point where the cities could not survive without horses, but they couldn't survive with them either. And then, within 2 or 3 years later, the problem had vanished. Now, there was no new law passed, there was no uprising of citizens or anything like that. What happened was technological innovation. 2 things became practical and became available right about that time. One of them was electric streetcars, and the other one was the gas-powered car and truck. Both of those things immediately solved the problem. They were far, far cheaper to operate and own and deploy than horses were. They were easier to maintain, too. They also had the advantage of being pollution-free relative to the horse. Now, the problem, in fact, the mayor of New York proclaimed the car as being the savior of the environment of the world because of the solution to the horse problem. Now, as we know now, cars had what economists call negative externalities to them too. They produce pollution and whatnot. And today, that has led to the crisis that we hear most about, and that is the global climate change. Now, the message in this speech is pretty simple. Human beings have an innate capability to dream up technological change. That's been our history for as long as there have been humans on Earth, since the first cavemen make fire, however they did it, until now. And it's likely to be the situation in the future too. Now, it is human nature that when there's no solution obvious right in front of us, we tend to assume there isn't any solution at all. And that's not the case. There are people working right now on it. I'll give you an example with the global climate change. Now, whether or not humans cause global climate change is somewhat in doubt, but whether there is change is not in doubt. But in any event, it would behoove us not to add to it, regardless of what causes it. But 10 years ago, you may remember that everyone said that it was impossible to build a plug-in electric car that would be practical and affordable. Well, today, 3 different car manufacturers, Nissan, General Motors, and now Tesla, are selling plug-in electric cars that cost $35,000. That's the average price that people pay for a car in the United States. The odds are this will continue into the future. So my message is that we should worry about these problems, but we should not despair about these problems, because it's highly likely that humanity will continue its many thousands of years of progress into the future.